Good evening. Welcome. My name is Thea Liberty Nichols, Associate Research Curator in Modern and Contemporary Art. Tonight's conversation is being held in conjunction with the exhibition Christina Ramberg, a retrospective, which I hope you've had the chance to see on view in the Modern Wing in the Abbott Galleries, but if not, it's on view until August 11th. As we begin, a brief reminder to please silence your mobile devices. It's my pleasure to introduce the reason why you're all here, the speakers for tonight's program, Julia Fish, Judith Kirshner, and Rebecca Shore, who will join me on stage in a moment. In her work, Julia Fish engages both site and context in temporary public installations, as well as the sustained sequence of paintings and works on paper developed in reference to the architecture of her home and studio. Fish's career-spanning record of curated group and solo exhibitions includes DePaul Art Museum's recent 10-year survey, Julia Fish, Bound by Spectrum. Fish is Professor Emerita, University of Illinois at Chicago. Judith Russi Kirshner was curator at the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago from 1976 to 1980, and the Terra Museum of American Art Chicago from 1985 to 1987. She is former dean of the College of Architecture and the Arts at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and former deputy director for education and Women's Board Endowed Chair at the Art Institute of Chicago. Rebecca Shore has been living and working in Chicago since graduating from the School of the Art Institute in 1981, where she went on to teach as an adjunct professor for 25 years. Shore made both quilts and paintings until 1994 and has primarily been a painter since then. Her current paintings explore an imagined world related to architecture and domestic spaces, often with an implied narrative. Her upcoming solo exhibition, Being There, opens June 27th at the Corbett vs. Dempsey Gallery in Chicago. So now, without further delay, please join me in welcoming Julia, Judith, and Rebecca to the stage. So I want to save the most amount of time to hear from our speakers, but I just want to say a brief introduction. The exhibition itself, the retrospective dedicated to Ramberg, is the first retrospective dedicated to her in over 30 years, and it's the largest and we think most comprehensive to date. And I worked on it together with my partner and co-curator, Mark Pascal, the Janet and Craig Duchessois curator of Prints and Drawings, sorry. And in our work on the show, which has been over the course of the past 3 years, we really from the outset wanted to create a checklist that explored the range of Ramberg's work across media with a particular focus on painting, and to draw key works from the different series and styles within which she worked, but to also exhibit work from periods or in media that was underrepresented or underexhibited during her lifetime. And we also worked very closely with the estate on the project, which allowed us access to additional material that was in this artist's studio at the time of her death or had been retained over time, including some material you see in the show or reproduced in the book, such as the doll collection and the slides and some sketchbooks. But I'm saying all of that because the speakers that I have on stage with me right now, it's a real privilege for me to be on stage with them. I never had the opportunity to meet Ramberg, but all of these speakers did, and they knew her in various capacities, personally, professionally, and otherwise. And they are going to speak to her drawings, her quilts, and her diaries. And those are the material that is really the heart and core of the show, but haven't received this treatment before. So it's really a special evening to be here together with them on stage, and I'm going to be taking notes. So thank you for indulging me. Let's hear from our first speaker, Julia Fish. Julia. During her lifetime, Ramberg's drawing practice was a private one. She drew and took notes in pocket-sized sketchbooks or on ruled graph paper and referenced this material as fuel for her paintings and quilts. Ramberg was fiercely inventive, but worked incrementally and iteratively, and this is most evident in her drawing practice. So as an artist, and someone who has a drawing practice in tandem with working in other media, can you tell us more about what you see or derive from Ramberg's drawings, as well as how you see them connecting to her larger practice? Thank you.
Thank you, Thea. And for the introduction, I will come to the drawings in just a few minutes. I first want to thank you and to Mark Pascal for the invitation to join Judith and Rebecca for this opportunity to reflect and think about what is a remarkable retrospective of Christina Ramberg's work that you both, you and Mark, and the Institute have brought to all of us. I want to thank as well to Katie Dyson and the engagement program staff who mic'd us and figured all of this out tonight, so thank you. I have to say at the start, after several visits to the galleries since the exhibition opened in April, I have to admit that I remain overwhelmed. It's the totality and the sheer visual force of Ramberg's work that I've encountered every time I've entered. Excuse me. I have to say, however, Thea and Mark, that you did me a service. I think you did all of us a service here. Let's see if I can get the first slide. Your brilliant decision as curators to place these two early painted objects together in one vitrine in the first gallery, side by side, offered an unexpected puzzle which is not yet resolved. It encouraged, for me, a reconsideration of Ramberg's works on paper, which were most familiar to me previously, and are the primary focus of the few images that I'll be showing you tonight. But first, to the puzzle. I had to take notes. We have similar images at actual size, more or less. Cabbage heads, same title for each, but not identical cabbaged hair, not identical hands intruding. Painted onto the other sides of so-called vanity mirrors, the figured subject's face is emphatically refused. Mirror object with mirrored subject, inseparable from its painted image, behaving as if in context, and yet, if the other side is the mirror's place, how can this side show and tell another's touch? Behind her back, so to say, or back of mind. These still confounding cabbage heads, I love that, became unexpected allies to Ramberg's drawings, sketchbooks, and diaries. Handheld, double-sided, other-sided, left and rightness. Her works on paper rewarded second looking, fostered second thoughts. Untitled, There's lots of untitled. So first to note, a simple felt tip pen, a felt point line, nonstop ink, we all know that tool. It's almost a bleed through. Gives us 5 contour views, the prone figure, horizontal, stretched out, is a rare instance in Ramberg's archive. But now, because it's double-sided, we see each profile shift against its partnered other side, or other self, a restless sleeper. Hair equals head, hair and pillow tossed and turned. Here, 3 of 9 torsos turn slow to their left, and 1 returns. Twice over, a forward finger tugs the corset. To a torso bound, upended on the verso side. So if I can do this again. Behind, we see this upended torso. And in person, in the Chicago Artists Prints and Drawings galleries, you can look close. You see the finger tugging. It's really great. So then what's this in the corner? I think it's an itch. The 2 framed rectangular elements in the work on the left, the view on the left, I should say, points towards a painting included in the exhibition, Probed Cinch. Seeing through coaxed and searching graphite, hints of pink are retraced. So we have this kind of density, an unusual moment. Ramberg would sketch, we can actually use that word, or sort of feel the form, but then return, of course, to the agile felt tip pen. Again, her hand drew these hands. This is from the memorandum sketchbook, and we can read across from the upper left image. We can, if you read to your right, we see as if the pages are turning of the sketchbook. It's one of many instances in which the sketchbooks bring images and text together. So she's referencing the Urmaro print, counting on her fingers the days of her husband's absence, lady counting the days, scratching her ear. To conclude here, adjacent, 2 of many similar sheets in Ramberg's archive, we have grid graph paper that measures out a rebus poem, text bits, fleeting thoughts, picture notes. From 1980 on the left, pinkish tints stand in for body skin. But in 81, skirts, shirts, pants, sleeves signal the embodied part. And here, fabulously, if I can aim, pattern reads as scar or fern. Perhaps for me, most poignant of everything is that left here from 1980, leftover painting ideas, large figures, numbered and orderly, so to recall, and soon accomplished, large figures indeed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Julia. I think in the interest of hearing the most from our speakers, we're going to go ahead with the next, and then we can converse amongst ourselves or see what time we are once we've all had a moment. Becky, thank you. So your first connection to Ramberg was as a student, and you went on to become a friend and fellow colleague. Together with Ramberg, you became quilting partners, each creating your own quilts, but working side by side, and as well as sharing fabric, patterns, and ideas. Can you tell us more about the evolution of your relationship with Ramberg over time and the ways in which you worked and exhibited your quilts in parallel? Thank you.
Hi, everyone, and thank you for coming. Thank you, Thea. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. I want to tell you a little about what it was like to be Christina's student and then her friend. I met Christina when I enrolled in her Saturday drawing class. Usually Saturday classes didn't fill that well, but people loved studying with her, so there were a lot of people there. As a teacher, she was very engaged, very attentive, thoughtful. People really wanted to talk to her when they were in her class. One of the things that she modeled was being very systematic in how she developed imagery. And you've seen that already from the show and from the remarks that Julia just made. She collected imagery and objects, and she made drawings of them. From these, she focused on what most interested her, and then drew many versions to explore subtle changes and how they affected meaning. As a young artist myself, I found this intentionality very, very empowering. The projects that she assigned were like a laboratory for learning how to be inventive. In her own notebooks, she would write, she would kind of brainstorm. She would say, what if I did X, Y, and Z? She would write lists. She would write evaluations of what she had done. In looking over some of her sketchbooks recently, I was kind of delighted to see that she wrote comments like, still boring, or blah. I appreciated her honesty with herself, but she would follow up, like she'd write blah, and then she'd write, is it because, and then list her thoughts about why that might be. While I was in her class, she showed us slides at lunch one day of her own work. I had never seen her work. I had not that long ago arrived at the Art Institute, and I knew her just as this lovely, attentive, thoughtful woman teaching me. And so when she started projecting her slides of her paintings, I was actually kind of shocked at the imagery. She was, of course, this was in 79, so it was, paintings prior to that, and they were quite erotic And some of them were, these kind of broken bodies. The interesting thing that really stuck with me is that she never talked about the content during that slide lecture. She really just talked about formal development. And I've thought since then, why was that? And having been a teacher now myself, I can think probably part of it was we were her students, we were younger, she didn't want to go into it. But I think that there are, when I think of the Christina I knew as a friend and a teacher, she didn't come off as dark. I've heard people who didn't know her talk about a lot of the imagery in the show as being very dark. And I think that we all have internal lives of some sort or another, and we don't necessarily talk about them. And certainly at that time, people did not talk about sexuality the way that they do now. It was much more private, and I think she was a private person in a lot of ways, although obviously looking at her work, we can engage with an internal life that she had. In 1981, I graduated. She and I would get together often, and we'd do ordinary things that women tend to do together, like cook and eat. Thea was just saying that she in all her talking to people, she hasn't heard one person say a bad thing about Christina. And I just volunteered, and don't take this too seriously, that she really wasn't a very good cook. But that was the fault of her 1950s mother. And I think had she lived longer, she would undoubtedly have become a very good cook. We'd listen to music. She introduced me to the American jazz standards, took walks, talked about clothes. We even watched TV. We frequently looked at what we were making in paintings and quilts. Christina had already been making quilts as gifts for family members. We both sewed our own clothes and had done so since childhood, so we were both competent sewers. The interest that we had in quilt making really came from looking at quilts in books and in person sometimes, coming from the traditional mostly women's communities who made quilts. And they were made in block patterns. So this is one that probably a lot of people are familiar with called the log cabin. That unit is the block. These shapes here are made of four blocks. And if you look, this is the kind of thing we were attracted to, both of us, which was every one of these units of 4 is different from the others. And I also suspect this is a black and white photo, that there were probably more than 2 colors, because I see slightly different grays. So that kind of formal invention was very attractive to us, and something that we, as we looked at quilt patterns, thought about doing. And then, just as a contrast, the other log cabin quilt is so very different, using patterned fabrics and a completely different take on the pattern. The block patterns that we used were disseminated in, aside from women doing them, learning about them from each other, there were booklets. And this, that's the wrench quilt. This is a quilt of Christina's from 1984. And you can see some of the things she does with that simple pattern. She doesn't repeat it exactly. She really is interested in varying how different those blocks can look. So here, that one really stands out in the quilt overall, but you can also really see the shape, whereas down here, she uses patterned fabrics that really dissolve the shape. A huge part of our making quilts was going to the, you know what I just realized? Do I even need to use this? Oh, great. Whoops. We went to the thrift store almost every week together to collect garments, to buy garments to cut up. And it was really important to us that they be garments and not just yardage of fabrics that we would buy at a fabric store. We even went so far as when we were together and one of us found something that we liked, that we both liked, we would split it in two and cut the garment in half so we could each play with that fabric. Christina wrote some notes from a conversation that she had with her friend and painter Sidney Licht. Quote, "The fabrics came with their own history, decades, 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, types of garments, pajamas, woman's dress, man's shirt. They're usually very assertive in themselves, have strong personalities, never having been intended to be paired with other fabrics of equally strong personalities." And here's kind of a wild quilt that she made. I sometimes divide her quilts into like the quieter ones and the more wild ones. These are not really colors that she used that much in her painting. And you can see she's really availing herself of some wild and raucous patterns to make this. We both built up large collections of fabric and stacked them on shelves according to pattern types. When I inherited Christina's paintings, her fabrics, I took a swatch of each fabric to document what she had. And I recently photographed them. There were about 500 of them. And I'm going to show you just a few slides with them grouped in ways that she grouped them on her pattern shelves. I mean, the stacks on the shelves were according to the type of patterns. So, is this working okay? Okay. The checks, florals, what I called wild 70s and 80s. And I was noticing, the labels on the wild 70s and 80s, they're kind of for garments that are sporty. I think that one says hang 10. And that she really delighted in that kind of detail. And the fact that these fabrics had histories was really important to her. Here more, I was really struck with these plaids, how much they look like her plaids and checks in her paintings. The middle one we used to call those glow plaids, where there was a gradation, and you've all seen her do that in her paintings. And the gray plaids look so much like patterns she would make. So she didn't have these prior to making those paintings necessarily. Some she did, but she was really gravitating towards an aesthetic that she had developed in her paintings. We realized as we worked together that we were, and admitted to each other that we were both scared of copying each other, which is kind of funny in the context of quilt making because that's kind of assumed in quilt making that you share a vocabulary together, whereas in the painting world it's often considered quite taboo. What we did to solve this problem of being inhibited by that was we just decided to make an agreement giving each other full permission to copy each other. And it really turned out to be very freeing and productive to not be worrying about that. And I think our quilts had things in common, but they also developed in different directions. Some more of the fabrics, stripes, grids, gingham. And then this hexagon quilt, which is a big favorite of mine. And being able to make this quilt really depended on having a lot of different large-scale plaids. And I noticed that there's one fabric that she cut up to make 6 different blocks. And see how different they all are? She was really, pushing it, how you could change those. Each hexagon is made up out of 6 triangles, how you could cut the fabric differently to make it really be a different hexagon. She kept sketchbooks for her quilt making, and like I was saying before, she would brainstorm in them, and she would also evaluate what she was doing. Over here, there's a little section that I'm going to mention later where she writes like chairbacks, meaning her own chairback paintings, which you can see in the exhibition, and also like Augustin Lesage, who was a painter who she greatly admired. Some of her quilts used a smaller range of fabrics, so here she's really focusing on stripes and checks and grids, and also a wider value range, so the yellows in the background. And she's also doing something we both were interested in, which was using diagonal shape to approximate like an isometric kind of perspective, and having an illusion of space. And she called this open box. In 1984, Christina took a trip to Japan and visited a lot of temples, and at flea markets she found striped fabric that she really liked. These are Japanese striped fabrics. Those two on top are not, and these are just other striped fabrics that she had. And she created this quilt, which Rei Yoshida immediately bought from her when she finished it, which she called Japanese Showcase. A lot of the fabrics are Japanese, but a lot of them are not, and I think she very skillfully makes them work together. Here, the Japanese Showcase quilt that you just saw, I've paired with one that she called Showcase Spin-Off. So she's doing a variation on that. And here, that's the block that's repeated. But what she's done here that I think is predicting her subsequent quilts is she's divided them with these black strips into columns. Now here, she did have two black strips. With both of the quilts, you'll notice that there's a border that's striped, and I think that she was very conscious of the fact that she was creating an illusion of a kind of shallow space in here by having that black edge and then a striped fabric that looks like it goes behind the black edge. And also there are these light spots, so you feel like you're kind of looking at a screen with light coming from behind it. So I think there were very strong relationships between what she did in her painting and what she did in her quilts. Going on from that, turning them into columns, she produced a number of quilts at the end where they really became separate columns. Here she creates a little bit of an illusion of space by shrinking that column relative to the others down and moving it up in the picture plane. And finally, these two quilts, which I think are the ones that she's talking about when she mentioned her chairback paintings and Augustin Lesage, because these shapes, the black shapes and the striped shapes kind of fight for attention. And really, this is very reminiscent for me of her chairback painting. So that's all I have.
Thank you, Becky. That was wonderful. It's so wonderful to see all those quilts, and especially the fabric swatches. Judith, you want to take the podium, correct? Yes. Yeah, of course.
I also want to thank all of you for being here, and especially mention the absolutely stunning show that Mark Pascal and Thea have blessed us with here at the Art Institute. And of course, I want to thank Julia for her incredible insights about the drawings. And you'll be hearing me reiterate some of the important points she made. And also Becky for really opening up a way of re-examining those gorgeous quilts. I'm going to start right in. Part one, I'm calling this because I only have two parts. So this is part one, and I'm talking about the diaries. I had the privilege of working with Christina's private diaries, and I'm deeply grateful to her family. The diaries are unpublished. They're small red leatherette notebooks. You see one on the left, and she kept them from 1969 when she was just married, a young bride, to 1980. It's a really 10-year self-survey of her thinking and her experiences. She records her ideas for art in an intentional pairing, I think, of contrast, words and images. Christina loved language, I believe. Think of her titles, one more clever and witty than the other. And she labeled women's liberation, women's whisperation, which I like better. Since the 15th century, women's diaries have served as companions. They're safe space to entrust your confessions, expose your vulnerability, your suffering, and your anger. Famous examples are Virginia Woolf and Frank Anais Nin and the artist Eva Hesse. Ramberg's diaries are unique, I believe, and unlike any others. For example, toward the end of this series, from 1976 to 77, the entries juxtapose three voices: her daily life accounts, which you see on the right, usually in blue or black ink, and then on the left, alongside of sketches, this for a painting that's in the exhibition Schizophrenic Discovery, are notes for her process of making the paintings. Actually, they meticulously diagram the painting in sections. It's a step-by-step record of her creative process, the time she spent on each part, and then each page is topped in uppercase with the early statements of her toddler son, Alex. So these are talking pages: ambulance, turn off lights, bicycle for bicycle. This is women's whisperation writ large. Christina described herself as, quote, sick with anxiety about one concern: is it possible to be a wife, artist, and mother too? She records everyday occurrences, including the most banal: cooking, recipes, washing her hair, laundry, and housekeeping, as well as some very keen observations of scenes on Chicago buses, caring for her cats, art objects in museums, and flea market excursions. With wit and a purely conversational tone in these wonderful pages, she shares experiences of intense sexual desire, unsettling dreams, and erotic fantasies. She tells herself, or she relays, fraught emotional interactions with her teachers, her family, and friends. And she often reveals her tedium at the frustration as well as the wonder of childcare. Because of her height, Christina had to often sew her own clothes, and she was a gifted seamstress, as Becky said, or she purchased them from Lane Bryant, and she berates herself constantly for spending so much time thinking of clothes and garments. You see those wonderful little sketches on the left. Her declarative sentences contrast with the poignancy of her confession. There's tremendous self-doubt about her body image. She lists her problems as stemming from parental disapproval about being too tall, lanky, having flabby thighs and white skin. The only exception was she likes her hands, and she does those beautiful paintings of hands. Similar to the smooth surfaces of her paintings, these tidy penmanship are always so neat. There are very few erasures, there are very few crossouts, even when she's describing the most disturbing or perverse notion. This is a painting, obviously, and a sketchbook. This is not a diary, but I wanted you to see how she revels in softcore porn, motifs thinking of bondage as subject matter, and guilt that she feels about showing women in pain, but loving it. So you see, she's a big film buff, by the way, and notes Belle de Jour with Catherine Deneuve, as well as showing us women swooning in ecstasy. In her work, there's a delicate transit between the textures of flesh and clothing, and there are also big indications of abuse. She says, quote, "I want to describe torn garments and soiled areas." Ramberg was a voyeur, and we stand in her place admiring her paintings. Her diary is explicit about her fascination with bondage and pain. Another quote, "The garment could be pulled back to expose hands feeling, caressing, masturbating the body," end quote. Pursuing these themes on a trip to Paris in 1973, she described doing drawings of hands alone and holding pieces of cloth. "I began," she says, "with a rather elaborate idea about women in pain, but loving it." This is part 2. Christina Ramberg, the exhibition. So how do we move beyond the richness of her archive, the collections, the revelations of her diary, to try to understand the totemic figures that she created on her own aesthetic terms? I think we really have to thank Mark and Thea again, because this stunning narrative installation demonstrates her brilliance as a figurative painter, her transformations, her endless permutations of form. What's perhaps the most striking for me is the scale shift. The early galleries exhibit the small works that Julia showed us with the backs of heads, mirror supports, and hands stroking elaborate hairdos, no faces. By the 70s, the heads are gone, and just the intricately painted textures of lace, hair, and netting adorn lingerie details. First-time viewers, I believe, can appreciate how very transgressive, fetishistic, and aggressive her cruelly bound, as she described them, her cruelly bound forms have become. On the other hand, from a contemporary perspective, I think Christina Ramberg was prescient, and this exhibition assumes social and political relevance, visualizing and taking apart the norms and rules that govern gender. We have now a larger framework and a context for the acronym LGBTIA. Perhaps Christina imagined these different and overlapping forms. Indeed, it seems to me that the notion of intersectionality, the idea that people, individuals, have multiple identities and can be members of more than one group, is applicable. And that leads also, and one sees it in some of these paintings, to simultaneous experiences of domination and submission. Certainly Christina Ramberg constructed a highly individual iconography of clothing and flesh. That relationship animates the intimate circuit of exchange that she mobilized in her art between her own body, her collections, those illustrations, costume drawings, and battered dolls, and her sensual representation of the second skins of fetishism. Ramberg, as Julia said, represents couplings, pairs of fabric and skin, as well as the unnerving reversals between the two, which is fabric, which is skin. An idea I'd like to paint, she notes, is a nude figure in which the skin becomes like body parts. For instance, a chest in which there is a ruffle of flesh down the front, pleats, tucks, and darts, all in flesh. Fragments and body parts are central to modernism, as you know, but Christina used patterns, I think, for making clothing to sort of serve as the structure for painted fragments that she includes in her violently cropped bodies. In a diary next to a sketch in red ink that I showed you before, actually, she wrote, so this is her sort of matter-of-fact description of a process, and goes to Becky's point about the gap between the dark content and how she worked. Have begun working down, from neck down, trying to be satisfied with each section before moving on. The armature side will be mostly exposed instead of so complicated with cloth bunched up and tied to it. The body side is revealed by cutaway clothing. I'm considering paring this panel down on both sides and the bottom, making the figure armless. So she's literally taking the arms off the painting. These compositions are monumental and in some cases alarming hybrids, I think. Ramberg imagines bound torsos and hips, expresses a desire to paint, and I quote, more areas of cloth around the waist and around the legs. She says, as I indicated before, she wants to suggest indications of abuse. Ramberg's exquisite fragments and fetishes now become hardwired into her paintings. This one indeed is called Wired. Compelled by images of the body in agony, Ramberg visualized scenarios of female masochism, and discovering historical archetypes, she repeatedly rendered the anguished contortions of the chest or the diaphragms of 15th century Italian crucifixions, which you see on the left. I don't need to share with you how she has repurposed them as vaginas and phalluses that often fill a thoracic cavity. Later, in a series which Ramberg referred to as split personalities, she focused, and I quote, on a garment reduced in size compared to the large overall figure becomes part of the figure. I invented a blouse form between the legs and the groin, and it is the vagina. And the way I painted it with red and green long strokes, I've made the form Rita's muscle, or forcep in this one. By 1989, Christina wrote, I have always recognized two strains in my work, parallel strains. One was readable, recognizable as figure image. The second was more abstract, metaphorical. At times, Christina's restraints become threatening. Her focus is fierce, both submission and domination are linked in contradiction. There is a tense relationship, I suggest, between these two states. It suggests a gendered double. I think that Ramberg's creations embody a paradox that is resistance itself can be alienating and uncomfortable, and in some cases, submission, being dominated, may be liberating. Acknowledge pleasure and pain is what Christina was saying, and create productive dualities. In 1977, she wrote, twice as great, twice as much, twice as many, double entendre, double time, double cross. Ramberg is purposefully subverting and intersecting traditional male and female difference. In the exhibition, we see this doubling over and over again. And this grouping, I believe, this powerful grouping of four monumental headless giant androgynes hold amputated arms and segmented bodies. They're puzzling. We can't figure out the relationship of these anatomical fragments. In this case, I believe, and in most of the later paintings, these large-scale paintings, the dramatic images of fetish have been, as I said, hardwired into the paintings and become the painting subject. The beautifully varied textures that we admire, her ability to depict hair, wood, and netting that formerly read as perhaps guarded, protective wrappings, lingerie, now appear to be aggressive and even menacing. Armored constructions of self, like prize fighters or wrestlers, they project enormous psychic power. I think her rich diary, Ramberg's rich diary, can be interpreted not one-to-one with the paintings or the quilts, as Becky said, but rather as evidence of a private process, textual backdrops for her unnerving, absolutely gorgeous visual experiments. And as I've noted, Christina can be very down to earth. In July 1st, in a diary entry of 1977, she says, "Things are clearing a bit, have finally gotten this off the ground." And in that same year, Christina confided again, and I quote, "I want my paintings to affect other people's consciousness. And as long as I'm holding back my paintings, my secrets, I can fantasize that when I do show them, they'll knock them dead." Thank you.
Wow. Thank you so much, Judith, Becky, and Julia. We have a very brief few minutes left, and I wanted to ask you all if you have questions for each other, or if you'd like to take one or maybe two questions from the audience. And do you want to use your? Yeah.
I wanted to ask Becky a question about the quilt making and how much time it took. I can't figure out from this exhibition how much great work this woman, who didn't live as long as we wanted to, could produce. I don't know when she wrote the diaries. We speculate that they were written at night. But I wondered, Becky, where did you and Christina work? When did you work? What time were you in a studio at home? Could you talk about the process for a minute?
Yeah, I could try to remember. We hung out a lot. I can't figure out why I don't seem like I have time for that now, but we would hang out doing just ordinary fun stuff, and then part of that for us was just talking about quilts. Alex, her son, used to complain that all we talked about was quilts, quilts, quilts. He got really sick of the whole thing. And I think there were periods of time when we were making quilts that she wasn't painting, and then periods of time, I'd have to look at the dates of the quilts alongside the dates of the paintings to figure out the overlap, or maybe study her sketchbooks more carefully. She did like to stay up late at night. And that's actually, to me, a really fun part of the diaries, is just seeing her have this, create this private time for herself where she wasn't going to be disturbed, where she didn't have other obligations. Yeah.
In a conversation that we shared a couple of weeks ago, we talked about sewing, and you mentioned that she had sewn most of her clothing, or a lot of her clothing, and I think we all shared the fact that maybe it's we made our clothes, all three of us. And Thea, did you make clothes? A little bit, not so much. So. Given what you've just said, Judith, and what you've just said, Rebecca, the fearlessness of cutting fabric is one thing that comes back to me, which is you have this yardage and you have parts of the body as flat shapes. You lay them on, you pin them in, and you cut. And eventually you realize that if it's a pattern, you might want to line things up. So there becomes an attentiveness to the edge of a form and a pattern and how a curved form changes the shape of that geometry, or if you want the floral to repeat in the same direction, you have to have more yardage. So for me, what I'm getting from hearing both of you speak tonight is just a sense of fearlessness of cutting in. And I do remember, I think, one of the passages in the catalog that from the diaries, that she did saw the panel as it was in process. And that's nervy. That's nervy. We didn't talk that much about the making of the paintings. And along with this discussion about fabric and patterning, laying the pattern on, I was struck after our conversation a couple of weeks ago that flatness and the fact that the paint goes on masonite and doesn't seep into the weave of a canvas is, in a sense, closer to the construction of the dress or the clothing than the construction or the illusion of the body. So those are just curious thoughts that have surfaced tonight. Thank you very much for leading me there.
I will add to that, or build on that, because when I was listening to you speak and looking at, I think, your second slide where you had the recto verso, those prone women, and really thinking about the dual image, it reminded me of the Evelyn Statzinger sketchbooks on view and for Chicago artists and prints and drawings, which Mark curated, which you noted. I believe it's the El Cerrito sketchbooks where Evelyn is working in watercolor and it's bleeding through and almost like blotted through, so that it's this completely self-referential sketchbook where one page bleeds into the next one through these blots. And I'm wondering if that's what you were looking at in those drawings. I know you were really focused on the dual image or the...
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
In the case of Evelyn's seepage, that's acknowledged, but I don't think built on in the same, maybe I haven't looked at the following pages closely. What strikes me in these close examinations of the double-sided works in the exhibition, the retrospective, and for artists in prints and drawings, is that we have this opportunity to, let me rephrase, I had the opportunity to imagine or question, was Christina aware of the fact that she could see through the page? And that said, of horizontal figures, it seems very clearly that she was using the one with the other. But then there are other instances in which she changes the direction of the page or has notations of an address or a letter that seem completely independent of the recto versus the verso side.
You can imagine her cutting out paper patterns as though it were a garment to diagram the different parts of the paintings too. And as Becky said, the distancing that happens with the black frames around the quilts happens in all the paintings with the wood-grained frame. That's a very insistent characteristic that you pointed to.
I was really struck, Becky, when you had the open box quilt up, because that's from the same year as a lot of the last geometric paintings, and where she's really starting to focus on volume of form. And it was so interesting. It's called open box, but I've never looked at those shapes in that way. It's so interesting how her work in quilting potentially led to a further exploration in her painting of a lot of those concerns of volume. She's always concerned with structure throughout her practice, I believe, and form, but it's a very different concern when she comes to those later paintings. There's not a question in there, but it never occurred to me until you brought that up.
Yeah.
No, I think it's an important reminder about so much of what Christina produced and what this exhibition so wonderfully underscores is that it's more than two things. It's the way she brings these two things together that creates such a powerful and in some cases unsettling unit that we have to confront.
And I see we're running over. I just want to say one more thing before we conclude. Judith, I don't have a question that was so complete. It was beautiful to hear. And of course, you're our essayist on the diaries and the catalog, and I didn't have the opportunity to say more about your long-term relationship with Ramberg. But the quote I think that you pulled from was a statement that she made for a show that you curated at the Terra Museum in 1987, which is such a wonderful statement on her practice, where she goes on to talk about just what I think we're all saying in a way, this duality between the content and the meaning, of the work. So this has been such a pleasure for me and a real privilege. Again, thank you all for joining me. And I really feel like we worked very hard over the course of these years to really think and rethink Ramberg's project, but this was beyond anything that we contributed to. So, I'll speak for myself, not Mark, but this was such a pleasure and an honor to hear from you on these levels and all these
Mutually.
perspectives. So thank you for coming.